Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin, Daf Kuf Chaf. We're going to get started with the very end of Kuf Yud Tet Amud Bet at the bottom. If you recall, we had the sugya between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, where Rish Lakish had read the Tosefta of the two bones, and it said this is only true for bones, that they work as a yad, but hairs do not work as a yad. And then Rabbi Yochanan said, what do you mean? Hair can even count as yad. And then we had a whole back and forth between them. We had two different versions of what exactly transpired. And with that, we saw a bunch of sources. Now we're going to see a reshuffling of this sugya and basically a moving of the sugya to somewhere else and say, oh, actually, this conversation between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish didn't actually happen on the line that you were on, that Tosefta. It actually was referring to our Mishnah. And who said what and what the details were also got a little bit different. Also, in this version, we're going to be a little bit different, and we're going to read it differently. Some people say this is referring to the Mishnah, meaning it's related to the line in our Mishnah, rotv kefa. Okay, if you look back at the Mishnah, go back on Daf Kuf, just go back on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin. Okay, and there was rotv kefa ha'alal v'ha'atzamot, if you remember the bones and the gidim and the karnaim. And now if you recall, let's just think about that Mishnah for a minute. The Mishnah there was discussing a bunch of different items that some of them were from the laws of shomrim. Okay, they're protectors, like, for example, the hide, the skin. And at the end, we had the tlafayim, the hooves. And we're going to see the bone. Now, the bone, right, can function, we said, as a yad or as a shomer. But in the Mishnah, it must be talking about a loss of a shomer. The bone is a shomer because it has marrow inside of it. So ha'or va'arotv ha'kifa mitztarfim l'tamei tumat ochlin. So all these things, the or, the rotv, the kifa, and etc., including the bones, for example, are joining for tumat ochlin. Let's just remember the two categories. We had either things are shomrim, they're protectors, or they are, and this isn't important for this part of the sugya, but it will be important for later in today's daf. But the other ones are things that are not really considered food, like the liquid that comes out of the meat, or the rotv, which we'll define soon, the kefa, which again, we're going to have to define all these things, but they're eaten sometimes with the meat. So because they're eaten sometimes with the meat, they actually have the status that they're going to count for impurity of food, to join together with meat, not on their own. They wouldn't be Matamei Tumat Ochlin if they were on their own because they're not really food. But since people sometimes eat them with the meat, they will be. So Amar Rish Lakish, going back to the issue here is the bones. Rish Lakish says, Lo shanu ela etzem davi shomer. Now when it says bones, it means bones. Okay, obviously it means bones. What else could it mean? Well, the bones are a shomer, they protect. Aval nima lo havya shomer. A bone protects the marrow inside, but a hair is not considered a shomer because hair isn't considered like it protects. Now, remember, we saw in the sugya before, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, depending on if you say it's attached to the meat directly or not. Anyway, right now we said it's not a shomer. And Rashi says, why is it not a shomer? Because it's a shomer al gavei shomer. It's got the hair, which is on top of the skin, and the skin is the protector, and there is no protector over protector, as we saw with the layers of the onions. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu nima nami havya shomer. Rabbi Yochanan says, even a hair is considered a shomer. Amarle, okay, so now we have this debate according to this. Rabbi Yochanan, again, this is a different version of the sugya completely. Rish Lakish says a hair functions as a shomer, and Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says it doesn't. Okay, you might remember before when we brought the question on Rish Lakish said hair is not a yad, and then Rabbi Yochanan brought a difficulty on Rish Lakish, and Rish Lakish answered by saying, oh no, that's a shomer. A hair could be a shomer, but not a yad. Here it's the opposite. He says, Rish Lakish says hair can't be a shomer, and Rabbi Yochanan says hair can be a shomer. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan Amar Filunima Nami Havi Shomer. So Rabbi Yochanan says it could be. In this version, Amar Le Rish Lakish the Rabbi Yochanan. Now here comes, last time, it was a question of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. This time Rish Lakish asked the question of Rabbi Yochanan. How can you say a hair is a shomer? Isn't a shomer al gabei shomer? Umi ka shomer al gabei shomer. Can you have a shomer on top of another shomer? We have an item protecting on top, the hair is on top of the skin. They say, it goes all the way, pierces through the skin, and it's directly on the meat, and that's why it's a protector of the meat directly, not a shomer on top of a shomer. We're now going to have the same sugya. It's just being asked and answered by the opposite right? It's the question here is actually on Rabbi Yochanan's response, not on Rish Lakish's. So Rav Acha said, "What do you mean tefillin? How can they write tefillin if the hairs make holes in the skin in the hide, and then it goes through to the meat directly? Well, then how do you write tefillin on parchment when there's holes in it? Habin and ktivat tamavaleka. You need a completely what do you say? A completely solid writing without any holes in the parchment." Each temitate, to which they answer his question by saying, "What did you forget?" Ha da'amri b'ma'arava, what they said in Eretz Yisrael, kol nekev shadio over alav eno nekev, any hole that the ink passes over, is that the ink can fill in, is not going to be considered a hole or perforation. To which, Eitiv Rabbi Yochanan l'Rish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan resolves the difficulty against him. It's not a shomer agabe shomer, it's a direct protector. Eitiv Rabbi Yochanan l'Rish Lakish. Now comes Rabbi Yochanan with the difficulty on Rish Lakish. Or sheyesh alav kazayat basar hanogea b'tziva yotzei mimenu ubasar rasha kenegdo tamei. My lab mishum shomer. So comes Rabbi Yochanan and says to Rish Lakish, what about this source? This source says if you have hide that's covering a kazayat of meat, and you touch a hairy string of meat that's coming out of there, or a thin string of meat that's coming out of there, or the more important part for our purposes, or a hair that's opposite there, it's impure. My lam mishum shomer. Are we not talking about this protecting? To which Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish answers, lo mishum yad. Rish Lakish says, no, that source must be talking about yad. And again, how each one reads the source is flipped from the previous sugya. Nima echad l'maychazia, but wait a minute. How could Rish Lakish claim this is a yad? How can you possibly use one hair? Keda'amar Rabbi Ila b'melai sheben amlaim. I got a better translation for this today. In on, but with among the ons. In other words, those are the pieces, the hairy strings that are on the stalks of wheat. They're called ons. So isn't it like Rabbi Eli said, like an on among many ons? Hachanami, likewise, just like he said it there, which in a minute we're going to remind ourselves where is there, we can say here, b'nima sheben animim, a hair among many hairs, which could function as a yad. To which the sugya is going to end with, Hecha itmar de Rabbi Ila. Where did Rabbi Ila say this? Ahad, it's not in the Mishnah that says, Hamalai shebashibulim mitamim umitamim ve'ein mitzdarfin. If you have on among, an on from the stalk, can become impure, can make other things impure, pass on impurity. It can itself become impure, and it can join together with an amount of other things to make them, with the grains themselves, to make it impure. Milai lamai chazeh. Now, what could this be worthy of? If it's just, how could you possibly call this a yad? Amar Rabbi Ila b'melai sheben hamlaim, because how do we know it's a yad? Because it's not mitzdaref. If it was a shomer, it would join. That was the whole sugya 2 dapim ago, where we had to prove that whole long complicated sugya on Kuf Yuchet, that if it's a shomer, it's mitzdaref. If it's a yad, it's not. It doesn't join in for the shiur at all. So the fact that this is a mitzdarfim must make it a yad. How could we possibly say that an on could be a yad who can hold a stalk of wheat by the on? Well, Rabbi Ila says, b'melai sheben hamlaim, we're talking about a stalk among many stalks. The rotv. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had listed a bunch of different items, and now we want to define them. And if you remember, as I said earlier in today's shiur, to remind you, which is the category that we're going to now talk about, are items that are going to join together to get to a requisite amount. Remember, kibetza you need, size of an egg of impurity in order to pass on impurity to other things, and maybe even to become impure themselves. And why are these items? They're not mitami tumat ochlin themselves. They themselves would not be impure, but they will join together with meat because sometimes it's eaten together with the meat. And therefore, to get to the size of the egg bulk, we're going to count it. My rotv. What is rotv? What are we talking about here? Amarava shumna. Rava says we're talking about shumna. We're talking about, Rashi explains, we're talking about the fat that you see floating at the top of your soup. To which Amrle Abaye, what's mo yitame tumat ochlin? Abaye says that's actually food. That in itself would be impurity of food, and we have to find something. As I said, what's the category here? Items that they themselves are not impurity of food, but they're enough considered somewhat food because they'll be eaten with the meat or with the soup or whatever it is that they're going to count. But that's only because they're not really food. But if you talk about that fat, that's actually called food. Ela chelev de krish. It must be congealed fat. My krish. So now the congealed fat, they say that oozes out of the meat. That's not really food. Okay, nobody eats that on its own. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. And this is going to lead to a whole long sugya about things changing form from solid to liquid, liquid to solid. My krish, why did you have to say it was congealed? Kilo krish nami, even if it's not congealed. Even if it's not congealed, it should join together for this requisite amount. How do we know this? The liquid that comes out of the vegetables can join the vegetable. In other words, you count the whole amount together. If you ate a vegetable with its liquid, you're going to count both the vegetable and the liquid in terms of coming up with the requisite amount of a kotevet, the size of a date, b'yom kippurim. That's the size that you're going to be obligated for eating on Yom Kippur. So we're basically making two comparisons here, and this is what's important to follow. Number one, we're comparing chelev, the fat, to the meat, the chelev combining with the meat, to the juice, right? And again, we're going to say the chelev, that liquefied, is to the meat just like the liquid is to the vegetable when it comes to Yom Kippur. So let me do that again. We have the chelev to the meat in terms of food impurity is like the liquid that comes out of the vegetable for Yom Kippur, for eating on Yom Kippur, for being liable. So we're going to have to, one of those comparisons is going to stay, but one is not. In other words, we have two comparisons. Let's just clarify. One is fat to, liquid, to the fatty liquid that comes out. If the fat liquefies to the meat is like the liquid that comes out of the vegetable. That's going to stay. But for Truma Ochlin compared to being obligated for Yom Kippur, that's going to be different. That's not going to be a valid comparison. That's how the Gemara is going to answer this question. Hatam mishum yituva datahu bechoduhu miyat v'date. There we're talking about on Yom Kippur, what's going to make you feel better? The whole idea on Yom Kippur is to suffer. You have to torture your soul, so to speak. Afflict is maybe a better translation. To afflict your soul. You need to not eat. Now, if you eat even this juice that comes out of the vegetable, while we may not really call it food in and of itself, but it will actually make you satiated. You won't be suffering anymore. You'll have some food in your body. So you're going to be obligated, even though it was just the liquid. And there, the liquid joins the food, but theoretically, it sounds like even if it's just liquid, that would be enough to actually give you some feeling of, I ate some food and I'm not suffering anymore. Aval hacha, but when it comes to Tumat Ochlin, it's not the same issue as eating on Yom Kippur. This is a fascinating topic because usually we say eating. What's defined as eating, right? Usually it's a certain requisite amount, and we think eating always means the same thing. But now we're going to see that eating for Yom Kippur is not the same as eating for something that would be considered food for impurity, right? Or it's not even eating really. It's just what qualifies as food. Now for that, mishum hacha mishum itzterufehu. Here we're trying to combine amounts. We're measuring. Does this have the size of an olive bulb? Now, ikrish mitzdaref, ilo krish lo mitzdaref. And this is why we're going to say the comparison of the liquefied fat to the meat is not the same as the liquefied juice of the vegetable to the vegetable for the purposes of Yom Kippur. Because if you want to say, does this combine to be considered all one food? We can't mix liquids and solids. Why not? It has to be krish, congealed. Because if it's not congealed, what's the problem? It's liquid. Now, liquid and solid, Rashi points this out, have different requisite amounts. Usually for a liquid, it's a revid, it's a quarter log. For a solid, it's a kazayid, an olive bulb. You can't combine one shear and one shear. They don't combine together because one's liquid, one's solid. So for that, it's going to have to be congealed. But for Yom Kippur, it's a completely different issue. And even on its own, theoretically, it sounds like it would be a problem. If you ate, let's say, you drank a revid of this liquid, it would be a problem. Okay, so, and that's because the issue is not seiruf, how do we combine two things? Is this called food? But did this satiate you or not? Did it take away the affliction of not having eaten all day? With that, we're going to go to the next section of the Mishnah. So, hakifa. So that explained the rotv. The rotv is not the shumna, it's not the fat at the top of the soup. It's the congealed fat that oozes out of the meat. Hakifa, my kifa, amarava pirma. So Rabbi says this is the meat that gets stuck at the bottom of the pot. You might know the Persians have this dish where they eat the rice that's burnt at the bottom of the pot. That's what we're saying here. It's like the meat at the bottom of the pot. You might remember I translated it when we got to the Mishnah a little differently. Don't worry, that's how we're going to translate it in a minute. It can't be the pirma. The pirma is actually food. It's meat that got stuck at the bottom of the pot. That's food. Like I said, the Persians love to eat that burnt rice at the bottom, right? Some people love to, the potato kugel at the bottom that's stuck to the pan. That's the best part. People eat that. But can't be that then. Amar le Rav Papa, Ella Amar Rav Papa, but Rav Papa said tavlin. It's the spices that are stuck at the bottom, right? That happens a lot when I saute with a lot of spices, and then you end up with this stuff of spices stuck at the bottom. That can join for the requisite amount because it's often eaten together with the food, but it itself is not food, and that's how we explain the Mishnah. Tananatam. Now we're going to bring a Mishnah. If we're already talking about turning liquids to solids, solids to liquids, now we're going to go back and talk about some other relevance of solids to liquids, liquids to solids. Tananatam. There's a Mishnah that says, Hikpa et adam ba'achalo. If you congealed blood and you ate it, and remember, you can't eat the blood, and it says lo tuchlu. Now we're going to go back to eating, and what we said, right, Yom Kippur, what you need to eat is some certain definition. Now we have a Mishnah, the psukim that talk about don't eat blood and don't eat chelev. Now you might think about it for a minute. Chelev is a solid. Blood is a liquid. Now normally when you say you can't eat a liquid, you say not to drink, but it actually says to eat, not to eat. So it uses the language of eating. And this is one thing we're going to focus on going forward. Hikpat adam ba'achalo. So if you congealed the blood and ate it, or you liquefied the fat, chayav, you're obligated anyway. To which the Gemara asks, Bishlama, I understand, hikpat adam b'achalo. If you congealed the blood, I get it. Since you congealed it, you obviously considered it significant, and therefore you turned it into the solid form, and you're going to be obligated. Now, it's not exactly clear why, just because I congealed it, does it show I meant for it to be significant? So Rashi says it's also because you turned it into because I think it's Rashi, let me just check. No, it's not Rashi, sorry, but the commentaries explain that what's the issue here? In the words lo tochlu, it means don't eat, and don't eat is a solid. So because you turned a liquid into a solid, it makes sense that lo tochlu will include that. Whereas if you did the reverse, if you say ela himcha, and the reason why they say this is because of the next line, himcha tachelev ukuma'o, but if you liquefied the chelev, achila ktiva be, it says achila, b'halav achilahu. This is not achila. Now you might say, wait, you can't eat on Yom Kippur. It doesn't say you can't eat and can't drink, but we know it you can't eat and you can't drink. But the difference, or other places where it says achila, where we say achila, shtiyaz bichlal achila. Drinking is included in eating, so why wouldn't you say that? But this is because it was meant to be solid. Most people don't liquefy the fat, meant to be solid, and it says lo tochlu, so it should only apply when it's solid. So now we have to understand why, if we liquefy it, are you going to be obligated? Amar Rish Lakish, Amar Kra Nefesh L'Rabot Et HaShoteh. So Rish Lakish quotes a pasuk by the Chelev where it says, Ki kol ochel chelev min ha'be'ema asher yakriv mimena. Anyone who eats chelev from the animal that you're going to sacrifice from it, Yishel Hashem, v'nichrita, from animals that are sacrificed generally, v'nichrita ha'nefesh ha'ochelet me'ameha. You will get karet. Okay, this is Vayikra Zayin, chapter 7, verse 25. So now it says here, you're going to get karet, but it says hanefesh. What does a nefesh mean? The soul. Now the soul, it could just say v'nichurta. Why does it say hanefesh? Hanefesh comes to include even if it was a different form. Okay, they're going to do this 3 times. Now they're going to take another 2 places where it says nefesh, and we're going to say that comes to include even drinking it, not just eating. So we did it right now by chelev. Now we're going to do it Tanya Nami. It also says a bright to the same thing. Gabe chametz, by chametz on Pesach. It says, ki agavna, in the same kind of way. Himchau ugama'o, if you liquefied chametz, im chametz anush karet, because you took bread and you liquefied it. If it has chametz in it, you're going to be obligated karet for eating chametz on Pesach. Im matzahi, if it's matzah, in other words, if you you liquefied the matzah and you wanted to fulfill your obligation on Pesach for eating liquefied matzah, ein adam yatzeh bo yedei chavato b'Pesach. You're not going to fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah. So now we have to understand the difference between the two. Bishlamai matzai ein adam yatzeh bo yedei chavato b'Pesach. I get why you're not going to fulfill your obligation on Pesach, because lechem oni amar chamana. You need to eat poor man's bread, okay, or poor person's bread. V'hai lav lechem oni. This is not we call it, the better translation is the bread of affliction. This is not a bread of affliction. It's a liquid. You can't call it a liquid bread. Ela im chametz manush karet. But why is it, if it's chametz, are you going to get karet for it? Achila k'tiveh be. It says don't eat chametz. Okay, and this is not eating. This is drinking. To which again, Amar Rish Lakish, Amar Kra, nefesh l'rabot etashoteh. Again, we have a nefesh in that pasuk. Okay, the pasuk is, okay, 7 days you should eat matzah. On the first day, tashbitu somer batechem, get rid of all the leaven. Ki kol ochel chametz, anyone who eats chametz, v'nichrata nefesh yimi Yisrael, they will get karet. Okay, but it says again, hanefesh. Third pasuk. V'tanya nami gabe nevelat of tahor. We're going to have it also by the carcass of a dead kosher bird. Okay, if you have a carcass of a bird who died on its own, who wasn't slaughtered properly, okay, we're going to have the same thing ki agavna. Now, you have to remember the nevela, the carcass of a kosher bird. If you eat it, which you're not allowed to, because you're not allowed to eat a carcass of a dead bird that wasn't slaughtered, but if you eat it while it's in your mouth, you become impure. It's called Truma and Bikurim. It's a very strange form of Truma. Most Truma is transferred by touching. This one is only transferred by eating. If you touch it, you won't become impure. Whereas if you touch a dead carcass of an animal, you will. But if you touch the dead carcass of, again, this is a bird that died on its own and wasn't slaughtered, same thing with the animal who died on its own and wasn't slaughtered, then while you're eating this kosher bird, the nevela, you will become impure. So it says by nevela of tahor ki agav himchau ba'or, if you liquefy the bird, right, the carcass of the bird, the meat of the flesh of the bird, with a fire, with heat, tameh, you'll become tameh. Even if it's liquid, while you're eating it, that's still called achila. Again, we're going to get back to the question why. Bechama, if it was liquefied by the sun, tahor, then you won't be impure. Ve'abinaba, and they asked, achila k'tiveh, but it says eating. Right, the whole pasuk. Okay, the pasuk. There's a debate exactly which pasuk, but we'll go with Vayikra Yud Zayin pasuk Tevav. Kol nefesh asher tochal nevela utrefa. Any soul who eats. Notice nefesh is there as well. Who eats a nevela or a trefa. The commentaries say this must be talking about a nevela of tahor, even though it's not clear because there's only eating that's connected with the nevela of tahor. It's the only nevela that gets transferred through eating, and it says if you eat the nevela, then you have to go wash your clothes, etc. Meaning get rid of your impurity. So you see in that pasuk, it says eating. But as we saw before, it says nefesh l'rabot etashoteh. That includes someone's drinking, who's drinking. Now we have to go back to the sun. We didn't really understand that. Why, if it was liquefied by the sun, are you not going to be impure? Well, that's because that's because it rots from the sun. Okay, that's disgusting. That's not anything. It's not going to be even in the category anymore of an avelat of Torah because it's ruined. Now we have to. So we have 3 cases. Okay, let's go through chelev, the forbidden fat, the chametz on Pesach, and the nevelat of tahor, the carcass of the dead kosher bird. Now the Gemara is going to have to say, Utsriche, why did you need a separate pasuk in each of the 3? Why couldn't you have learned one from the other? We're going to go through again. What's the stringency in each one? Then on account of that, we could say, oh, maybe that's why it's going to be, even in its liquefied form, impure or forbidden, but not in any of the other cases. So tzricha. If you had chelev, you wouldn't be able to learn chametz because sheken lo hayta lo shata kosher. Chelev was never permitted, whereas chametz before Pesach was actually permitted. So that makes chelev more severe. Nevela lo atimine, you can't learn from chelev to nevela, sheken anush karet, because chelev has karet, so does chametz, but nevela doesn't have karet. If you ate a nevela of tahor, you're not going to get the karet for it. If the Torah had written chametz, you wouldn't be able to learn chelev from there. Sheken lo hutar michlalo, because there's no heter for it. Chametz is never permitted. Okay? Once it's forbidden on Pesach, it's never permitted. whereas chelev will be permitted. Okay, we're going to see where is chelev permitted. That's something we're going to get to later. I'll already tell you just so you understand what they're talking about. Chelev is not permitted in a domesticated animal, a behemah, but the chelev of a chaya is actually permitted. So there's a case where chelev is permitted, whereas chametz at Pesach will never be permitted. Unavela lo atimine sheken anush karet, and you can't learn nevela for the same reason as we said before that you can't learn nevela from chelev because you can't learn from Pesach either because Pesach also is karet. If you wanted to say it by nevela, you couldn't learn the others because nevela has a severity that it actually carries impurity, whereas the other ones don't. So we just proved that you can't learn any one from the other. But maybe you could learn one from two. Hey, Tite, which two? So don't put it down by nevela, but you could learn from the other two. Malahanach from chametz and chelev. Malahanach sheken anush karet, but chametz and chelev both have karet, more severe than nevela, which doesn't have karet. Lo lichter brachmana b'chametz v'tite mehani. What if you just didn't have it by chametz and had it by nevela and chelev? Well, malahanach sheken lo italem shata kosher. Those are neither of them was ever permitted. The nevela, once it died, it's not permitted. The chelev was never permitted. Lo lichter brachmana b'chelev v'tite mehanach. Maybe you could have learned right the chelev from the other two. But malahanach sheken lo tumi klalan, the other ones are more strict than chelev because they're both never permitted, whereas chelev does have a way it's permitted. So tomar b'chelev shutar michlalo, you could say maybe it's not true for chelev, which has this permissibility. Maybe it also wouldn't be forbidden in its liquefied state. So we're now going to say umay nihu. Now, what is this heter michlalo? Even though I already told you, but the Gemara is going to go through it back and forth. Maybe we're talking about ilem a chelev behema legavoa. Well, the chelev of a domesticated animal can actually be burnt on the altar. So maybe that's what we mean. To which they say, nevelanami istre malikat of legavoa. But wait, malika, you might remember this, a bird needs shchita, just like animals do. But in the temple, there was a special way of doing it called malika, which if you did malika outside the temple, it would actually be considered a nevela. It would not be kosher. But specifically inside the temple, you can. So that means that a bird actually has a heter, and a nevela oaf is actually going to be permitted in the temple because what's considered a nevela outside the temple is actually considered kosher inside the temple if you did malika. Malika is, if you remember, taking the finger, the Kohen takes his finger and breaks the back of the neck of the bird. That's how he kills the bird in the temple. Okay, so it can't be that because then they both be in that same category, and we said this is unique to chelev. El chelev chaya lehedyo. Maybe it's chelev of a undomesticated animal, like I said before, to a regular person, right? Meaning not in the temple. But nevela nami ishtrei malika chatara of lekohanim. Nevela also, by the way, has a way that a nevela of a bird could be actually permitted to someone who, to the kohanim, in what case if you did malika in the temple, but the kohanim can eat it outside the temple. In other words, they could, well, actually not, they have to eat it in the temple, but the point is, it's more like a hedyo because someone regular can eat it, a kohen. To which the Gemara is going to say, no, that's not a knockout for that option because la'olam chelev chaya lehedyo. It really is. The heter is the chelev of chaya to a regular person. But the kakashelach kohanim, you asked about kohanim. Kohanim is shulchan gavoa kazachi. The kohanim, it's not like they're eating it as regular people. They're eating it because it was permitted on the table of God, and the kohanim were allowed to eat from the table of God, which means it's still in the world of sanctity and not in the world of hedyot. And we were trying to find some parallel to hedyot. So in the end, you end up with the chaya, an undomesticated animal. There's a heter for the chelev, but there is nothing parallel in the regular world to in the carcass of a dead bird. There's no permissibility anywhere, and that will be our answer. So what's putar michlalo? That a chelev of a chaya can be eaten by a regular person outside the temple. Now, obviously inside the temple there are no chayot. They have not brought us sacrifices. Okay. That was the first part of the sugya, which is showing you three different examples: chelev, chametz, and nevelat of tahor. That all three of them, we're going to say, in their liquefied state, chelev and chametz are forbidden, and you're going to get karet for them. Nevelat of tahor, that's liquefied. When you eat it, you will become impure. Comes the Gemara and says, "V'hadetanya hatmeim le'esor tziran v'rotvam v'kefa shelahen." There's a special drasha by shratzim, by creeping creatures, that if you liquefy them, okay, that's the tzir or the rotv that comes from them, and the kefa, which we talked about just before. Lamali. Now, you learn the fact that these liquefied shratzim are also forbidden to eat. right? You can't eat a sheretz, and you can't eat them in their liquefied form either. We learn it from the He Yediyah, the direct, we call it the direct principle, right? The tmeim, definite principle, hatmeim. So lamali, ligmor mehane, why don't you just learn it from the other three? Why do you need a special drasha? We now have 4 drashot to teach, right? Each one has its own reason. So the other 3, we just explained why we couldn't learn from one from the other. The sheretz, you should be able to learn from the 3 of them. Well, sriche, de'ilo katav rachmana, if it didn't have a pasuk here, hava amina, I would have thought that yolavo menadin liot kanidon. We just saw this concept, which is when you learn something from another thing, you can only learn to the extent that it's true by the other items. So what's the difference here? Well, you would have said in all those other items, chelev, chametz, and nevelat of tahor, it needs a certain requisite amount. What is that? Kezayit. Hatama di'ika kezayit. Afachanami adi'ika kezayit. You might have thought also here, it's only until you have a kezayit. Okay, with that, we're going to turn to Amud Bet, and it's not true for the shratzim, and therefore, lichtav rachmana b'shratzim. Oh, sorry. Let's stop there. So that's why we're going to say by shratzim, it's even a smaller requisite amount. It's ka'adasha, the size of a lentil. So if we had learned shratzim from the others, you would only say it in its liquefied form if it was an olive bulk, but not if it's the size of a lentil. And what Hatmeim comes to teach you is even with the size of a lentil in its liquefied form, it's going to be a problem. Okay, it's going to be forbidden. To which the Gemara says, oh, sorry, let's go back to the beginning of the page. From the top of Amud Bet, why didn't you then just have the pasuk by shratzim? And then we could say the others could be learned from there. No, because exactly for this reason, because you could have knocked out that drasha by saying that comparison by saying shratzim has a chumrah. What is that? Shratzim shaken tumatam b'mashu. Shratzim, their impurity is in any small amount, and therefore, and because they have even a smaller amount like an adasha, therefore, in the liquefied form, they're forbidden as well, but not necessarily true for the others. So now we see why we needed 4 different verses for all of these cases. Now they're going to bring up other cases where this is said. Haditanya hatevel v'chadash v'hekdesh v'shvi'it v'kilayim. Okay, we have 5 things mentioned in this bright. The tevel, untithed produce, which you're not allowed to eat. Chadash, which is the new produce before the korban omer, the omer sacrifice was brought on the 16th of Nisan. You're not allowed to eat the new crop until you bring that sacrifice. Ha-hekdesh. Again, these are all items that are forbidden to eat. This is something that was sanctified to the temple, forbidden to benefit from, forbidden to eat as well. Hashvi'it, if you planted and reaped produce on the sabbatical year, it's forbidden. And kilayim, if you planted grains in near your vines within a certain proximity. Kulan mashkima yotzim mehem kemotan. Any of these are going to be forbidden if they become liquids. So, minala, what is the source for this? To which the Gemara says, now maybe you'll say we can learn it from all the other ones. We already have 4 different ones that we can learn it from. So why don't we learn it from them? To which they answer, Shekain isur haba me'elav. Malahanach shekain isur haba me'elav havu. All the other ones are prohibitions that come from within, meaning not done by human intervention. Okay, chametz, Pesach comes and it becomes forbidden. Chelev, it's just the fat of the animal, forbidden from the get-go. Shratzim, okay, they're forbidden because of what they are. What's the other one I'm missing? Chelev, nevelat of tahor, it just died on its own. So none of those happen because of human intervention. But malahanach, but what about these? Shekeni sur haba me'elav havu. Now these, now it's a little tricky that it says these. Rashi says these actually only means only one of them, which is hekdesh. Okay, Tosfot differs and says maybe you could see some of these other ones that way, but we're going to focus on Rashi. Rashi says that hekdesh, what's the issue with hekdesh? How does something become sanctified? I say this is sanctified. I'm going to bring this animal to the temple. Whatever it might be. I say this food is going to the temple. So I sanctified it. It's done by humans. So maybe, so again, Malahanach, we can't learn from there because those are all Isur Haba Me'elav. But some of these other ones are not Isur Haba Me'elav. They're done by human intervention. Again, the Hekdesh. So Tina Chechad Isur Haba Me'elav. So fine. The ones that happened on their own, like tevel, it was just produce that wasn't tithed, or some of the chadash, it grew. And okay, now again, maybe you could say human intervention, and some people do. But anyway, let's just go with the rest of them are not. So those we can learn from the other four. However, the question really is asking about what about the ones that came about, the prohibition came about by human intervention, and maybe you wouldn't have been able to learn. Maybe in that case, in their liquefied form, they wouldn't be forbidden, so we need a new pasuk for this. Where are we going to learn that from? Well, the first attempt is to say Gamrina mi bikurim. We learn it from the first fruits that we bring to the temple on Shavuot. Ubikurim gufayu minala. Now, how do we know that bikurim in their liquefied form are also going to be considered bikurim and can be brought? And we're going to see exactly in what way, not necessarily in every way. Ditani Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says we're going to learn a drasha here. By bikurim it says you're going to velakachta mereshit kol pri ha'adama asher tavi me'artzecha. You're going to take from the beginning of every fruit from the ground that you bring from your fields. Okay, so first there's the word pri, then we're going to darshan tavi, that you bring. So it says here, priyatamivi, you have to bring a fruit, meaning not in its liquefied form. So when you go and bring your fruits to the temple, they have to be in fruit solid form. V'yatamivi mashke, you can't bring a liquid. However, hey v'yanavim, what if you brought your grapes to the temple, but you didn't yet recite the recitation that you're supposed to say when you do it and put it down in the temple? Udrachan, and you stepped on those grapes and turned them into wine. Minayin, how do you know that this actually works? Talmud lomar tavi, because the pasuk says bring. Bring means kind of anything, okay? Bring is an inclusionary term, okay? Whereas pre meant specifically a pre. But then it says tavi, bring, meaning you can even bring these as bikurim as long as they were fruits when you got into the temple. So we can learn from bikurim, which the sanctification is very much like hekdesh. I determine which of the first fruits are the ones I'm going to bring to the temple. So Ella, now I still have to pick the first ones, but I designate them as being sanctified. They're not sanctified until I designate them. So we call a mifrach. No, you can knock this out because you could say Bikurim has a stringency that's not true by hekdesh. What is that? Shekain tu'unim kriyav anachai. You have to do a recitation. You have to put them down. It's not the same as just hekdesh, which is just sanctified. Ella gamar mitruma. So let's learn it from truma. Truma is very much like hekdesh. You determine this part of the food, right? This part of my produce is going to be truma. I'm going to give it to the Kohen, and we can learn it from there. How do we know truma in its liquefied form is going to be truma? Truma gufa minalan. Di takash lebikurim, because we make a hekesh, a juxtaposition between truma and bikurim. This is going to be a bit of an atypical hekesh. You'll see in a minute. Damar mar. It's not usually a hekesh as we have two things in the same pasuk together or right next to each other in two psukim next to each other. And we say, we can learn one from the other. This is all in the same words. Utrumat yadecha. Okay, it's pasuk talking about when you can't eat in your gates, the maaser of your produce, etc., and any promises you gave to the temple, and trumat yadecha, and the truma of your hands. What is the truma of your hands? Elu bikurim. They translate trumat yadcha as bikurim, first fruits. So now what do we say? It's not exactly a juxtaposition. It's saying they called bikurim truma. From there you learn that you could learn from bikurim to truma. So it goes like this. From bikurim, which we learned already from tavi, even if they liquefy once you're in the temple, they're still going to be bikurim. From there we learn it's still going to have the sanctity of truma, even if it turned into a liquid. And from the truma, we're going to learn back to hekdesh. Okay, and that's our answer. But they say, what do you mean? But wait, that's not going to work. Because truma, you get the death penalty. If a non-Kohen eats truma, you get the death penalty for that, and you have to pay an extra fifth. That makes it much more serious. So they say, fine, why don't you take truma and bikurim together from that? Because the chumrah of bikurim isn't in truma. Well, that's actually not true. Both truma and bikurim have the death penalty. A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat them. And he'll get the death penalty. Okay, it's actually not the death penalty by the court. Both are death in the hands of God. But either which way, it's death, and they have to pay the extra fifth. So you can't say Truma and Bikurim because they both have a stringency that isn't in hekdesh. So they say, fine, And that must be what they meant. We're going to learn it from Truma and Bikurim. What they mean is Truma and one of the others, chametz, chelef, nevelat of, or nevelat of tahor, or shratzim, and Truma, or Bikurim and one of those. Okay, and then the chumras in each don't exist in the other. And with that, we could learn to hekdesh. So with that, we've resolved learning all of the different parts. Now we're going to continue along in this idea of liquefying and specifically talk about Truma. And the background you need to understand for this is the Truma. And according to the Pasuk, it's Dagan, Tirosh, v'Yitzhar. Dagan are grains. Tirosh is wine. And Yitzhar is olive oil. So Truma, actually, the obligation for Truma by Torah law, most of the Rishonim understand that the only obligation in Torah law is on grains, wine, and olive oil. Now notice wine and olive oil are liquids already, and then you have to take Truma and give a part of that to the Kohen, okay, when they're in their liquid form. The rest of the produce that we take Truma on is all by rabbinic law, according to most commentaries. There's a bit of a debate about this, but according to most commentaries, and then you have to understand that the Sugya is talking about on a rabbinic plane, okay, because otherwise we're going to talk right now about honey that comes from dates, okay, we're going to talk about all sorts of solids, but then we have a liquid form of them that's a bit more atypical. Haditnan dvash tamarim, which is silan, date honey. Yain tapuchim, wine that comes from apples. Chometz sitvaniot, the vinegar that comes from sitvaniot, they say are the grapes. I think it's what is it? Yeah, it's certain grapes that are from the fall season, which are not regular grapes. They're not really considered grapes. Most people don't really make wine from them. So it's vinegar. So it's not in the tirosh category. Ushar mine perot shel truma, and other kinds of fruits of truma. Rabbi Eliezer mechayev keren v'chomesh. So here are liquids that came from truma produce. Rabbi Eliezer obligates you to pay keren and chomesh if you're a non-Kohen who ate these. For Rabbi Yeshua poter, Rabbi Yeshua exempts. Okay, now, what's important to understand here is they both think that if it came from grapes or olives, since truma in general is taken from the liquids of those, right? Normally you would take wine and then separate truma from there. What if you separated from grapes or from olives before you made the wine or olive oil out of them, and then they turned into a liquid? Do they still have the sanctity of truma? To that, everybody will agree, yes. Because in their liquid form, you can take truma from them. So even when they're solids, since most of the grapes and most of the olives are used for olive oil and for wine, so even when they liquefy, we're going to say that the truma status is still there. However, in these other cases, like dates and apples and anything else really, if they were already truma when they were fruits, but you liquefied them, there's a machloket. Rabbi Eliezer says you're obligated. There's still sanctity of truma, so if a non-Kohen eats them, he has to pay. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you don't. So what's the root of their machloket? But my pligi. Well, they have a different approach about how to darshan things. Bidon mina umina, ubidon mina va'oke ba'atre kam biflige. One says we learn from there and completely from there, and one says we learn from there, but with the characteristics of its own self. So what does that mean? Ma bikurim. Now, what are we learning there from there? We're learning from bikurim to truma, if you remember, from the trumat yadecha. How do we know the liquids that come out of it will have the same status? Well, we learn it from bikurim. Uma bikurim mashkim hayotzi mehem kemotan. Av truma nami mashkim hayotzi mehem kemotam. Just like bikurim, the liquids that come out of them are considered like the bikurim themselves, and you can use them, bring them to the Kohen and say the declaration on them. Even truma, also the same thing. Again, the liquids are going to have the status of truma, but if you're learning it from bikurim, we're going to learn it completely from bikurim. Now, even though truma is only really by dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar, those three things, the grains and the wine and the olive oil, but ma bikurim afilu sharminim, bikurim applies to other things as well, other produce, not just, it's the first fruits of all your different fruits, not just those three things. Av trumanami afilu sharminim, and that's why it's going to apply to truma in all other kinds as well, because we're going to do dom mina umina, learn from bikurim and completely from bikurim. Rabbi Yeshua, who exempts, says the opposite. Savardomina, we can learn it from Bikurim. Ma Bikurim mashkima yotzim mehem k'motam, af Truma mashkima yotzim mehem k'motan. The principle we learn from Bikurim, but okay, but it should be learned out with the characteristics of Truma. Ma mashkim dekodshim b'Truma. What's sanctified by Truma? Tirosh v'yitzar'im midiachrini lo. Only the grapes and the olives, but not right. Only the wine and the olive oil. Midiachrini lo, but nothing else. So if you had grapes, now again, there's a difference between if you took the Truma from wine and olive and wine and olive oil, for sure that's Truma. But we're saying here, what if you made Truma for grapes and olives while they're in their original state, and then they liquefied? For sure, everyone agrees that it's still going to stand, because even if you learn from Bikurim to Truma with its own characteristics, it will apply to those. But midiachrini lo, but not to anything else. So after we've established this machloket between them, they now bring two more mishnayot and Truma there. Haditnan, the fact that it says ein mivi'im bikurim mashke ela hayotzei min hazitim va'anavim, you can't bring bikurim from a liquid unless it comes as olive oil or wine. Mane Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, this is Rabbi Yeshua's position. Da'amar domina va'okei ba'atre v'gamar le'bikurim mitruma. So you can't bring bikurim now. You have to say it like this. Bikurim can't come from liquids unless it's wine and olive oil. Now, where would he possibly get that from? The only way to learn it is from Truma. So now, if we go with Rabbi Yeshua, what did he say? Do minava okay ba'atra. Learn from, now here you have to be, it's a little tricky. We learned from Bikurim to Truma, and then we said, though, but Truma with its own characteristics. So we learned the concept that you could have liquids by if something was a solid and turned into a liquid by Truma, it would still keep its sanctity, but only for olives and grapes. And then Garman Lahula Bikurim Truma, because we have a hekesh, the juxtaposition goes in two directions, then we learn back to Bikurim. If it's only going to be true, though, for olives and grapes, just Rabbi Yeshua's position, we're going to go back and learn from there back to Bikurim, and Bikurim it's only going to be true for other things. So if you bring Bikurim to the temple according to Rabbi Yeshua, because we're going to boomerang it back to Bikurim, and it was a solid and then became a liquid, only by olives and grapes is this going to work, not by anything else. Obviously, Rabbi Eliezer would disagree. And then we're going to have a haditnan ein sofkim et ha'arba'im mishum orla. You're not going to get lashes for orla, ela ala yotzei min hazitim anavim, from a liquid, fruits, right, on your tree for the first 3 years. If they turned into a liquid, well, you're not obligated unless they come from olives and grapes. And this is again going to be the same thing. Mane, this is Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, this is obviously Rabbi Yeshua's position, because he says, Da'amar dominava okay ba'atra. Now you have to make another step here. Gama levi bikurim truma. We learned, right, again, we're going to have to do all the steps. We learn from bikurim to truma, from truma back to bikurim, and then from bikurim back to Truma, back to Orla. Because, okay, we're now going to say, Hadran Orla pri mi Bikurim. We're going to have Gzera Shava, the word pri appears in Orla, the word pri appears in Bikurim. So once we say Bikurim is only Zaitim and Anavim, also the liquid of Orla, you'll only be obligated if it's olives and grapes, nothing else. Okay, so all those Mishnayot only really fit with Rabbi Yeshua's position. Okay, now we'll do our quick review. We started with this other version of the sugya of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about the seiruf of tumat ochlin, right? About the etzem and the shomer, right? How it's etzem but not a hair, okay? And how it's a din of shomer, but it doesn't have a din of yad. And Rabbi Yochanan with the opposite position, and then all the other parts fit in along with that version. Then we explain what rotv is, we explain what kefa is, and from there we got into things liquefying and solidifying, and we had the 4 sources for those 4 cases, and then why we can't learn hekdesh from there. We had to learn hekdesh from Bikurim, and then we learned it from Truma, and Truma was learned from Bikurim, and then we had a whole back and forth about what we can learn from Truma to Bikurim, and then from Bikurim to Truma, and then from Truma to Bikurim, and that was within Rabbi Yeshua's position. And with that, we finished our daf, wishing everyone a good day and a Shabbat Shalom.